welcome to absolutely everyone, whatever time zone you're on. I think we have people from many different countries. I want to thank our translators in Egypt and Benin and Brazil for the translations they're providing, and you really are very welcome. So I want to share about how Jesus really is incredibly smart. Now, you can come at this from more than one angle. Some people will say, well, of course, he is God incarnate. God knows everything. Therefore, Jesus is smart. I want to come at it from a different angle, which is the Gospels are close to 9 hours long when you read the full Gospels out loud. About 47.5% of the Gospels is Jesus saying things. Therefore, we have just over 4 hours of Jesus's teaching recorded in the Gospels. And I want to say that based on that, we can see that clearly he is incredibly clever and perceptive. And we're going to start off with our first session on how Jesus interacted with people. And the first thing we notice is that when he talks to people, he calls them to hear. Very often in all four Gospels, you have this theme where he says, let someone hear. We have in the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this repeated saying, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. And that's a really important thing for Jesus, because it's not just that you could study very hard, it's that you actually need to listen spiritually to discern what he's saying, or you will miss it. And in fact, this hearing emphasis comes in every gospel. At the end of Jesus's famous lesson on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, the parable of the person who builds on good territory and the person who builds on sand is based on whoever hears his words. He will say in Mark's gospel, hear of me, all of you, and understand. When someone says that his mother is blessed, he says, well, it's really blessed if you hear God's word. That's in Luke. In John's gospel, he'll say, my sheep hear my voice. So I want us to think about two particular Greek words and to learn them. These come in Mark's gospel at the beginning of the parable of the sower in Mark chapter 4 and verse 3. He says, listen, behold, the sower went out to sow. The Greek word listen is akouete, that's highlighted in green, and the word to behold, to see, is idou, highlighted in yellow. Let's put it like this. Akouete is to listen. It's a bit like the word acoustic. And idou means behold, and it's a bit like the word to see that we have in the ID letters of video. And so when Jesus told this parable, he told people first to listen, then he told them to imagine the sower going out to sow. And what's so striking in the earliest manuscripts of this, so Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century, is that you have this word akouete, which I've just highlighted with an arrow, which is to listen. And then we have this word behold, which I've highlighted with another arrow. But notice the word behold, idou, sticks out a little bit into the margin. And the reason for that is because it's beginning a new paragraph. So in Mark's gospel, the paragraph division does not come before the word listen. Jesus says listen, and then there is a pause. Then when you're listening, he says, I want you to imagine a sower going out to sow. It's not just in that manuscript, it's also, here's another manuscript from the next century, Codex Alexandrinus. You have listen at the end of the column, and then you have at the beginning of the next column with a very large letter I, idou, behold. Or you could look at this manuscript, which is in my city in Cambridge, and there you have listen at the end of a line, and then behold, sticking a bit out into the margin at the beginning of the next line. That's what generally is happening. This is Codex Vaticanus in the Vatican. Listen in one line, behold the next line, not sticking into the margin, but with a little line telling you, and that line may not come from the very earliest time of this manuscript, but tells you there's a paragraph break probably between these two words. There's one manuscript of the earliest 5 manuscripts that doesn't have this paragraph break. It's got a slightly different word for listen. So in other words, the vast majority of these manuscripts, even though they are handed down in different countries, have this paragraph break, suggesting it goes all the way back to Mark, and Mark is, of course, reporting what Jesus said. In fact, this paragraph division doesn't just turn up in Greek manuscripts. It survives into Latin manuscripts. Here's a Latin manuscript that was now in Ireland, and there's the word listen, audite, and then you have a pause and a big letter, and then ecce, behold. Here's another Latin manuscript, the famous Lindisfarne Gospels. Listen is at the end of one line. Behold, out into the margin, is in the next line. And so what we're seeing is it's been handed down from one language to another, that you need to pause after the word listen and really make sure you are listening. Even in the Anglo-Saxon version of this, we have the word hear, and then we have a punctuation mark, like a cross, before you get to the parable. Now, modern translations in most of our languages don't have this paragraph division, but this is the earliest, and we need to get back to hearing that. And so when I was involved in editing a Greek New Testament at Tyndale House, we made sure that we put that paragraph mark in. We have listen at the end of one paragraph, and then behold at the beginning of the next. And when we did that, we suddenly realized that Jesus tells the story of the sower, and then he gets to the end, and he has, you can probably see a very similar word, listen, where he says at the end of that paragraph, let the one who has ears to hear, hear. So it begins telling you to hear, it ends telling you to hear, because for Jesus, it really, really matters that we listen. And that's something we don't do enough in our cultures. We tend to be very busy, but actually to listen to God's word is key. So that's the call to hear. Now, I want to think about questions. So we've thought about hearing, now about questions. Jesus asked a lot of questions. Here's a point in Mark chapter 8 where he asks 8 questions in a row. Now, asking questions is not inherently good. Socrates asked questions, that was good, but so did Satan. Satan's first words in the Bible are a question. Did God really say you shouldn't eat of the tree, the fruit of the tree? So questions in themselves aren't inherently good, but Jesus uses questions a lot because they can be used to probe morally. Because a question makes someone do more work than simply a statement. When you ask a question, they have to do some work in order to reply. And Jesus doesn't use just any old questions. He uses questions that probe deeply into people. But we have a problem. Nowadays, in most of our languages, we have question marks. But back in the day of the New Testament, they did not have the question mark. Perhaps it was invented a few centuries before Jesus and used, but we don't see it turning up in manuscripts until the 5th century in Syriac and probably around the 8th century in Greek. More research is needed to be done on question marks. There's plenty of PhD to do there. But what you see is there is a division between our time when we have question marks and Jesus's time when they don't have question marks. And that means that when we translate into our languages, we make it so that everything, every utterance is either a question and ends with a question mark, or it's not a question, it doesn't end with a question mark. We have no place for the non-binary. Now, we hear a lot about non-binary today, but clearly there are sometimes utterances which are somewhere between a question and a statement. And I want to draw your attention to one which occurs in all four Gospels. This is when Pontius Pilate encounters Jesus and he says to him, in many translations, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Then Jesus replies, again in many translations, "You have said so." Now, how does that make sense? Because Pilate has asked, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Well, you just said so." And we should object and say, "Well, Jesus, surely that's not right." Pilate didn't say, "You're the King of the Jews." He asked a question. But when you look at the Greek of this, and this is remarkable because all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, record the same 6 identical words for Pilate in Greek. He says, in order, "You are the King of the Jews." Those are the 6 words that he says in a row. And grammatically, that can be a statement, or it can be a question, or it can be somewhere in between. You're not quite clear whether this is a statement or a question. You could imagine Pilate looking up surprised and saying, "You're the King of the Jews?" Or he can look bored. "You're the King of the Jews?" It can be various things. We don't know, and we don't have to know. But what happens is Jesus takes this utterance of Pilate and says that within God's sovereignty, Pilate has uttered a sequence of words which testifies that Jesus really is king. He really is sovereign. He's so much king that even the words that Pilate thought he had chosen testified to Jesus's kingship. Now, why is this important for Jesus's teaching? It's important because sometimes we may not recognize that Jesus is asking a question. Take, for instance, in Luke chapter 15, the parable of the lost sheep. Jesus begins to ask a question, and in most translations, in most of our languages, it will say something like this: "What man of you," this is in green, "having 100 sheep, if he lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that's lost, until he finds it?" Question mark. Then Jesus continues without a question mark. "And when he's found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing," and so on. Now, that question mark makes us think that Jesus begins a parable as a question and ends it as a statement. And it focuses everyone's attention nowadays on the thought, well, does a shepherd leave the 99 sheep in the desert or not? And some commentators say, well, yes, he would. Or some say, well, of course it assumes that there's another person to look after the sheep and he leaves them safe. And so some people say, no, that's really unusual to leave them in the desert. And commentators aren't really sure. But some of the problem has occurred because we think of part of the parable as a question and the rest of the parable as a statement. The same happens in the next section where Jesus asks about the woman who's lost some coins. Or what woman, this is in green, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and diligently seek until she finds it? Question mark. Then in our translations, it ends as a statement. And when she's found it, she called it together. The point is this: let's remember when Jesus taught, there weren't question marks. Therefore, to divide half of it into question and the other bit into statement is an artificial division. Now, I'm not saying go and criticize your translations, because actually this is a very old question mark. Can you see those 2 walking legs with a number 7 underneath? That is from Middle English. That is a 15th century manuscript showing you that question mark. That question mark is an old question mark, but not as old as the New Testament. So our translations are good, but we need to remember that Jesus asks even more questions than we think. In fact, sometimes an entire parable is asked as a question. So the parable of the lost sheep is asked as a question. The parable of the lost coin is, as a whole, is asked as a question, because the whole of the activity is surprising. Jesus uses questions very powerfully. He also uses 90 questions in Matthew's gospel and 10 counter questions where people ask him a question, and instead of giving an answer, he asks them a question. And so this is what we have. I want to show you some of these. Jesus is asked, why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? Jesus doesn't respond with a statement. He asks a question. In red, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? Or look at this one. They ask him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And he then says, which of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Or they asked him, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders in the way they don't wash their hands? He says, and why do you break the commandment of God? Then we find that the Pharisees come and they say, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And Jesus then says, have you not read? In other words, he asks a question. Someone says, teacher, what a good thing must I do to inherit eternal life? He asks a question. Why do you ask me about the good? Again, do you hear what these are saying? They say, he says, yes. And then he asks the question, have you never read, out of the mouth of babes and infants, you have prepared praise? Again, another question here and another question here. Why do you put me to the test, you hypocrites? And another question. You see, where people ask Jesus a question and he asked them a question back. As for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what it was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, it's very interesting when you look at these questions because you actually see some patterns. People object to the waste of money. And he says, they say, why this waste? He says, why do you trouble the woman? Because when you look at the analysis of these, you can actually see some patterns. Several times, Jesus' counter question begins like this: have you not read? In other words, it's a question which points them to the scriptures. That's a frequent pattern. It's not just any sort of question, it's a question pointing them to the scriptures. The other thing that we have very, very commonly is a question about why do you break the commandment of God? Why do you ask me about what's good? Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Why do you trouble the woman? In other words, he's asking people to give an account for their motives for why they do something. So you've got two of these sorts of questions: a why, asking them to look at their motives, and have you not read, driving towards the scriptures. And so these impulses we see in Jesus's teaching help us understand a lot about his method. He calls people to listen, he points them to the scriptures, and he points out their moral inconsistency. So that's the first and the briefest session we're going to have. And we have an opportunity for some questions. We're going to make this quite brief because I want to press on to a really meaty section. So I think over to you, Jamie, for some questions at this point, and I think I stop sharing.
Perfect, thank you. So looking at the questions, we can go ahead and start with, when we are speaking with non-believers, do you think it is a good idea for us to answer their questions with questions?
So we are not Jesus, and we're not the judge. So when he says, why do you, he is speaking as the one who is going to judge the world. And one of the things that he does do is he's pointing out moral inconsistency. And this is a very important thing uh, to convict people of sin. We see those inconsistencies. People tweet one thing about one topic and then they tweet another thing about another topic that's inconsistent. A politician condemns one thing but doesn't condemn something similar when it's done by their own group. These sorts of inconsistencies are very important because they highlight our moral corruption. However, when we approach people, we don't approach them as a perfect person approaching a sinner. We are sinners approaching sinners. And this is a different dynamic because we also want to highlight how we are morally corrupt. We are morally corrupt, but we are saved because of Christ's sacrifice. And so that's a difference. So I think there's a place for using why questions, but they've got to be used in order to help people understand that actually we are all morally inconsistent. So I think that as Christians, calling people to hear, pointing people to the scriptures, and humbly pointing out moral inconsistency, both in ourselves and other people, is something that we can do.
Great, thank you. Our next question says, are there any instances where Jesus asks questions that are meant to be answered by the reader, but it might be misinterpreted as a rather rhetorical question based on context?
So Jesus doesn't talk to the reader. And when we talk about reader, that's not the first category that comes to mind with the Gospels. We tend to read the Gospels, although we can now listen to them as audiobooks, most of us. But of course, they first come as books that would be read out loud. So I think it's important for us to think about the hearers of the Gospels, but Jesus addresses people in the Gospels, the characters in the Gospels. He doesn't directly address the hearers of the Gospels. I mean, I think when he says, he who has ears to hear, it's an address to the people surrounding him at the time. But of course, then in his sovereignty, it's a call to us.
Great, thank you. Our next question says, are the why and the have you not read questions the only ones Jesus asks, or are there other kinds?
There are other types of questions. I just think, and as I say, there are 90 questions in Matthew. I'm just looking at a prominent type of counter question that I think people have not necessarily noticed enough. Is pointing to the scriptures and the pointing out moral inconsistency.
How about if there were no question marks in the original, how do we know that the whole is of a parable is a question rather than just part?
The reason I would say it's a question is because it begins, which one of you or what woman who does this? So it begins with a clear grammatical question. It's a word, which person, it's a question asking word. So there are ways of marking questions which don't require a question mark. In fact, question marks first came to mark the utterances which didn't have a where, when, how, why, clear question beginning. So it does begin like that. And the reason I would say it's either all a question or it's a series of questions is in order not to switch halfway in a story, in the middle of a story between a question and a non-question. I think it's smoother. It makes more sense to say that the whole of it is a question. Then I don't have to think, is it surprising that he leaves the sheep? Or is it not surprising that he leaves the sheep and that he calls his friends and neighbors for this level of celebration? So in other words, the thing as a whole is the surprise, not just one part.